Okay, very good. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started here. Finish off with chapter 6. Okay, so we left off here on committees, right? So what I want to do first is I want to explain what committees are, and ultimately reference back to the legislative website here. So when we look at legislative committees, what I want for you all to remember in terms of why do we study legislative committees, what is their purpose within the Texas legislature, and basically within any type of legislature, whether it's Congress or a state legislature. In more recent years, what has happened is that legislatures have decided to use the committee system in order to get their work done. Now, what I mean by this is that when you have these legislative bodies that are so incredibly large, such as Congress with, when it comes to, like, especially in the House with 435 members, and then you look at the Texas legislature, right, with the 131, with the 150 House members and 31, senators, right? So especially in the House, right, there's tons of members, right? There's lots of these representatives here. It would be very difficult to be able to get anything done if you just had everyone in the same room together, basically, talking and debating each other and things like that. It would just be very chaotic. Imagine like the way like a school cafeteria is, right? Where you've got all those students eating at the same time. So instead, we have a system set up where the members don't meet as a whole all that often. Instead, so if you actually look at the actual like chamber, right? If you whether it's there in Washington and there at the U.S. Capitol or at the state Capitol in Austin, you won't normally see that large cavernous chamber with all the desks. You won't see that too many people. You won't see all the members there in that room at the same time that often. That usually only happens when you have debating on a bill that's gotten out of committee, right? So what I'm trying to explain here is that the committees act as a way to try to sift through the bills when it comes to the standing committees, right? So the standing committees, you can make an argument these usually tend to be the most important committees because these are the permanent committees, okay? These are the committees that deal with the everyday public policy issues and responsibilities that government is responsible for. So now let me show you all the let me go back to the page over here. So hold on. So now let me show you all the now I'm going to reference this. Okay, so we were talking right now about the Texas legislative website, right? So when we're looking at the committees, take a look at the listings of some of these committees, okay? So we got agricultural, livestock, appropriations. This basically deals with money. We've got business. Obviously, of course, the calendar. We've got defense, veterans affairs, criminal jurisprudence, county affairs, corrections, energy, environment, healthcare, higher education, homeland security, insurance, juvenile justice, land and resource management, public education, natural resources. So does this make sense in terms of what I'm saying, that these are the major public policy responsibilities that government is responsible for? They're responsible for overseeing all of these, right? When it comes to education, when it comes to even private, sector areas like healthcare, there is still government involvement and government regulation in these areas, right? So these are these are these would be considered the standing committees, right? Because these are those everyday public policy issues and concerns, right? And then the Senate, they're not going to have as many, right? Because obviously, of course, there's less members in the Senate, so they're not going to have as many here. But they also have some subcommittees, like the subcommittee on higher education, which we're going to get into that here in a bit, because that leads us to subcommittees. But what I wanted you all to understand is that the standing committees, again, these are the ones that we mentioned here. These are the important committees that deal with those public policy concerns, and they are the only committees that can actually get involved in the lawmaking process by actually looking at bills that have been introduced and deciding whether they're going to make it to the floor. Because I mentioned that the committee system allows for a way for these 150 members to not just be all chaotic with each other, right? Instead, they all go to those different committees. So they all go into the different rooms, and they're all deliberating about bills that have been introduced to their specific committees, right? So, and we'll talk about that when we talk about the lawmaking process, right? But basically, the committee system is set up in a way to make the lawmaking process much more streamlined. So you don't just have all these bills just being introduced and then everyone's just all debating each other and it just becomes really chaotic. So instead, you have a system in place where the bills have to be approved. They have to kind of be sifted through by these committees. And ultimately, if the committee feels that it's good enough to be able to make it to the floor for an actual vote, then that's that's the way it's going to be, right? That's the role of these committees. Now, subcommittees, right? You all saw that one of the subcommittees in the Senate was the subcommittee on higher education. So education is a good example for a subcommittee because a subcommittee is a committee that focuses on a particular issue that's related to a standing committee issue, right? So when we look at higher education, it's still considered education, but it's different from K through 12 education, right? Obviously, of course, higher education is, does have its differences, and so it definitely requires a subcommittee. Wouldn't be enough just to have an education committee look at all the levels of education, but you have a subcommittee that specifically deals with higher education and those specific differences, right? Because again, with higher education, some differences would be like the lack of state testing, the financial aid, financial aid, of course, being there, although that's more of a federal issue, but the states do get involved with that with like the Texas grants and there is, state funded financial aid. Other issues would be like accreditation and ensuring that the colleges and universities meet the accreditation standards that's set forth by an organization called SACS, that's the Southern Association for Colleges. But obviously, of course, the state also gets involved in ensuring that, they work together with SACS to ensure that the colleges and universities are, retain their accreditation. This is usually done through data that's sent over to the state. I mentioned before how we have the course learning outcomes, the course learning objectives. Those reports have to be sent over to the state so that the colleges and universities can ensure that they retain their accreditation status. Because you don't want to have a situation where you're going to school somewhere and then they lose their accreditation and then your degree is meaningless, right? At least while you're getting it. Because we don't have ex post facto laws, right? They can't go back and say, oh, well, it's no longer accredited, so now your degree that you got 10 years ago is no longer accredited. Well, it was accredited when I got the degree. So, but anyway, that's all that's right. We also have some temporary committees, ad hoc, that basically means temporary. So conference committees are committees that occur when during the lawmaking process where if you have two versions of the same bill that have gone through the House and the Senate, then they meet together to try to iron out the details, right? This is, conference committees are comprised of members of the House and the Senate, and they try to work through those details. And basically they create a new bill with taking all of those compromises, and then they send it back to the chambers to be voted upon, because the bills do have to look exactly the same. We'll talk more about this when we get to the lawmaking process here in a bit. And then, of course, we also have select committees that deal with very specific circumstances. Like, of course, a great example was the Ken Paxton impeachment with a select committee that dealt specifically with that investigation, right? Because it's not every day that a high-ranking government official is, under threat of impeachment due to, criminal impropriety or things like that, ethical issues and things like that, as we saw with the Ken Paxton situation, right? Of course, he was not not removed. He was acquitted of those, but those allegations were made, and ultimately allegations strong enough to warrant him to be impeached and go through the process. And of course, we also have interim committees. These are committees that meet during the downtime of the Texas legislature. Because remember last time we talked about how the Texas legislature meets once every 2 years for a spring semester, a couple of months. These committees meet continuously, basically just to check to see how the laws are doing, how the funding is doing, how are the everything that's been implemented by the Texas legislature, how's it all working out? Is it working out? Are there concerns? Does the interim committee, do they need to look at certain problem areas? Whether in preparation for the next legislative session, or maybe try to see if they can, maybe have the governor or some of these other executive officers maybe try to look at some of these issues that they might bring to their attention, type of thing. So they also do a lot of investigative work. They go and they meet with these state agencies and ensure that that they're doing their job and adhering to the laws that were passed by the legislature and the policies set forth from those laws, right? So they do a lot of investigative work here in the interim committees, because they meet in the interim. Interim, of course, means in the meantime while the legislature is no longer in session. Okay. So let's get to legislative staff here. Okay, so these, of course, are the unsung heroes of government in the lawmaking process. Of course, And these are not just the people that go and get these are not just the staffers that go and get the coffee, right? Everybody always like makes fun of that, right? I mean, of course they do, but they definitely do more than that, right? Now we're going to take a look at some of these major legislative staff groups, but the book talks about how inadequate staffing means legislators cannot easily access essential impartial information. So remember, I shared with you all that one of my good friends in Laredo is a staffer to one of the congressmen. I'm not sorry, the state rep out there. So sometimes even I get a little bit confused here because there's so many of these. Like there's Congress and there's state legislature and all that, but it's for the state rep that's out there. So she works for him. She doesn't make that much money. It's a part-time job. So that should already kind of be a red flag in terms of how little money the state affords to their legislators. I mean, look, they only get paid $7,200 a year. So imagine the paltry amounts that they're going to have to be able to pay their staffers. And again, I mentioned it's a conundrum because it's such an important job, but yet they make less than maybe someone who's going and working at Target. Which no disrespect to someone working at Target, it's just that this type of work that's being done in an office of a state representative is extremely important. It's these are the laws of our state, right? This is the people of our community that are being impacted by these laws in our state. And if you don't have people that are going to be adequately paid, you might not necessarily get you might not necessarily get the best qualified, right? Or the people who are desperately needed in a position like that. It's something where unfortunately because of the low pay, you might not. Now, of course, my friend is brilliant because she's a precinct chair and she's been very involved, politically speaking. So she's brilliant. But right now she's studying to be a teacher. So what happens when she gets her certification and becomes a teacher? And it might be hard for her to still keep that job there at the state rep's office because it's you got to do what you got to do, right? You have to be able to still make a living. So like I said, the reason why I mention this is because I want you all to understand that this is an issue, right? That if the staff aren't adequately paid, the legislators also don't have access to a wealth of material. I mean, they have the library there at the Capitol, and of course, we're also going to take a look at the Legislative Council. But what happens is that because this information is not readily available, this allows for interest groups to step in and provide information to these legislators. We'll talk more about this when we get to the interest group chapter. That basically what they do is the interest groups get involved in the legislative process by providing research and information and studies to these legislators. However, though, you have to keep in mind that depending on which interest group is providing you this information, that it might not always be impartial, right? If you've got the NRA sending you articles and research, now the research does have to be sound, right? They can't just make up stuff. However, though, the way it's presented, that is always something that you can look at, right? At the NRA or let's say the NAACP or some of these other organizations, if they're bringing information to you, you have to take it with a grain of salt because they're not going to provide you with statistics that are going to go against what they stand for or what they're advocating for, right? So it's not that you can't necessarily trust them. It's that because again, the data does have to be sound. It's just the way they present the data, right? And this will be more so like whenever you all take stats classes, you'll see more what I'm talking about. That the way the data is framed and presented can pose a problem, So you have to know the source in terms of where it's coming from. So because the legislators do not have adequate access to the research themselves, and in a lot of cases they don't even have time to do that research themselves, then this allows for the interest groups to say, hey, I've already done the research for you. Here it is. All you have to do is just read the abstract and you should be good, right? I mean, that's going to be very enticing for people who are starved of time. And so it does become an issue because of the lack of funding that the legislators don't necessarily have the they don't have the adequacy to be able to really do their due diligence when it comes to looking, when it comes to researching, issues, right? Also keep in mind that going back to another point that we made last time, right, that the majority of these legislators are either attorneys or they're business, right? Now, you have to keep in mind that if you are in the legislature, you are going to be responsible for voting on all kinds of bills relating to all kinds of public policy, right? I showed you all that list, right? So it's not just all business, right? There's healthcare in there, there's education in there, there's criminal justice. You're not going to be able to find someone who has had experience in all those fields. Technically, I do because I've worked in a hospital, I've worked in a prison, and I've been a teacher. So I didn't do that on purpose. That just kind of gave it all right. But I certainly wouldn't claim that I'm an expert when it comes to healthcare. I mean, I was just a record keeper, so I was just a paper pusher, so I wouldn't be able to tell you. I wouldn't feel qualified when it comes to looking at, like, medical malpractice and insurance. That's not really, I didn't do any of that when I worked at the hospital. So you see what I mean? Like, that you're going to have to vote on all kinds of legislation. And so what happens is that, you have these legislators that might not necessarily know too much about all these other areas, but they still have to vote on this stuff. So that's, of course, why I advocate for a more diverse legislature, where we do need to have educators in there, hospitality workers, construction people, things like that. I mean, but that's a whole other story. But anyway, let's get to the the legislative stacking, right? So, okay, so when we're looking at the legislative budget board, okay, so the book talks about how that in Texas we've got a variety of different ways for budgets to be proposed, in terms of so of course, like at the federal level, the president proposes the budget. So here in Texas, we also have the governor who proposes the budget, but so does the legislature, and this is where the legislative budget board comes into place. So the legislative budget board, which is a joint committee that's made up of 10 members, both of the Senate and the House. And basically, these tend to be the people that are chairs of the money committees, right? Like the Appropriations Committee, the Ways and Means Committee. These are the type of people that are going to be on the legislative budget board, because their role within the legislature is money-based, right? So of course you're going to want those people on that board, because they're probably the most qualified when it comes to crunching the numbers, when it comes to setting up the state budget here, right? So of course, also there are professional staffers that work together with the legislative budget board, like we'll talk in the next chapter about the people that work for the office of the governor, as well as people that work for a variety of these different agencies, right? Because if you are a state agency, you're definitely going to want to be in constant contact with the governor's office and with the legislative budget board, because you want to know how much money you're going to get, right? And they might ask you some questions, right? They also might ask for reports, like, hey, send us your send us your yearly financial reports, right? Or even on a monthly basis. We want to see how much money you're spending, what you're spending it on, because we're going to determine whether you actually need that money. So there's definitely a lot of communication and research that's being done here. Now, the Texas Legislative Council, this goes back to what I was talking about in terms of researching of bills. This is basically, the book talks about how it's basically the state's version to the Congressional Research Service, which again, this council basically provides, they provide bill drafting resources. They provide research. Basically, they tend to be in charge of, like, the library there at the Texas Capitol and all that. So that's their main focus, is to provide research accommodations for the legislators. But as I mentioned, this pales in comparison to what they can get from the interest groups. And then the Legislative Audit Committee is another committee, and these people, they're responsible for, if you all know what an audit is, right? For those of y'all who might be studying business, right? An audit, of course, is where you look at the books, right? Kind of like, so this is similar to what the Legislative Budget Board does, except that the Legislative Audit Committee does this after the money has been, dispersed, right? So this is them checking on the agencies and how they're doing, and ensuring that they are, spending the money the way they're supposed to, right? And of course, this legislative committee is comprised of some of these other members, from the Legislative Budget Board, such as the chair people of the House and Waynes, So again, because both of these are dealing with money, it probably makes sense that you're going to have the same type of people here on these committees. Additional sources, of course, the Texas Research League and the Legislative Reference Library, which I was mentioning here a little while ago. So again, these, of course, are other entities that can also provide assistance for the legislators. Again, mostly when it comes to researching of issues, and also assisting with the the bill drafting process. Kind of like they give them trainings in terms of how to introduce legislation. Should they also give them trainings on, like, the Robert's Rule of Order, and how to, you've probably seen some of that, like, on the news, right? Whether like on C-SPAN or something like that, where they'll show like know what I'm talking about, right? Where they're like, being recognized, and the formal way that meetings are run, right? So they're definitely getting some assistance on that as well. So these other additional sources, again, they're meant to provide support and assistance for the legislators in terms of doing their job here. Okay, let's get to the lawmaking process. Now, I've said before that when you compare the three branches of government at the federal level with Texas, that the Texas legislature tends to be the branch that tends to look the closest or mirror the closest to what we see at the federal level, because again, the setup is pretty much identical, as in terms of having the bicameral legislature, the House and the Senate, and their different responsibilities. But so is the lawmaking process. The lawmaking process is also pretty much the same. So let's get to. So if you're familiar with how a bill becomes a law, if you learn that from federal government, then this should be almost a mirror image, right? But let's go ahead and still review this here, right? So bills can originate in the House, in the Senate, or simultaneously, right? There are some, of course, that do start in the House, like when it comes to the appropriations, that has to start in the House. When it comes to money, but a lot of these can start in either one, or they can start at the same time and then kind of race to the to the finish line. But some of them can start at the same time, right? So let's also take a look at the types of resolutions. So in terms of resolutions, we have what's called a simple resolution. This is basically kind of like your everyday upkeep type of resolutions. Getting the house in order, getting things started, as well as recognizing members, like for trivia things, like let's say it's their birthday or something like that. They'll give like a shout out or something like that. So that's why it's called simple resolutions. Because they're simple in their scope and things like that. Doesn't mean that's not important, but it's simple to get done, right? Now, concurrent resolutions, these are resolutions that require both of the chambers to actually agree, right? So the book talks about how adjourning the legislature would be an example of a concurrent one, because both chambers have to agree to this, right? And then we also have what's called joint resolutions. Now, the book talks about how the joint resolutions, these are for the constitutional amendments. And we talked about this in chapter 2, that in terms of getting a constitutional amendment on the ballot, that you need the 2/3 vote in both the House and the Senate, and then it bypasses the governor. It's done through this joint resolution process. So the book talks about how that if the legislature is going to engage in a joint resolution, then that's kind of like a cue, like a tip off to be like, okay, they're going to try to propose to amend the state constitution. Now, there are some procedural differences between the houses, and again, this is also similar to what we see at the national level, right? So the speaker has greater choice in which committee to send a bill to. And a lot of this is because there's a lot more of these committees in the House, right? There's just a lot more choices. Some of these committees kind of overlap a little bit as well. Like you probably saw that there's several, several of these, committees when dealing with appropriations. So the speaker can have more leeway in terms of deciding where these, where these bills end up going. With the Senate, with the lieutenant governor, it's a little more straightforward because there's not as many committees here. Now, there's also different calendars, right? So keep in mind that because these two chambers are separate from each other, yes, they're the same legislature, but they're being run by two different people. You also have to keep in mind that they also have different calendars, right? They're going to, when it comes to the different calendars, yes, they have the same 140 days, but are they going to go through the same order of what they want accomplished? Like, let's say, there's 5 things that need to be accomplished, for the legislative session. Let's say, they got to do the school voucher. That's what's going on right now in the special session, right? They got to get the school vouchers done. They got to get, obviously, of course, the budget, right? For the whole state, right? Now, you could definitely make an argument that the budget's going to be number 1 on that list. But let's say after the budget is taken care of, then what? What if Dave Phelan doesn't want to get to school choice till later? What if Dan Patrick wants to get it done as soon as the budget is done? You see what I mean? Like, so the different calendars, yes, it's going to be dependent on the presiding officers, but because the presiding officers are independent from each other, they can basically decide what order they're going to work on things. And they might not even agree on what those 5 things are. So you have to, look at that in terms of, and of course, they definitely are talking and they're trying to, be on the same page. But as we talked about before, it can be difficult when you've got two of them at each other's throat, so to speak. So, and then of course, another difference is that just like at the national level in Congress here in the U.S. Senate, the U.S. Senate also has unlimited debate, just like I'm sorry. So the Texas Senate has unlimited debate, just like in the U.S. Senate. So they also have to filibuster and as a means to kind of delay the process type of thing. Whereas the House, it's a lot more limited. They've got uh, there's a lot more of that record keeping and all this and that. When it comes to how many minutes, you probably have seen it maybe like on C-SPAN or I know like I know I reference I reference the Congress a lot because unfortunately we don't Texas doesn't have their version of C-SPAN. So it would be nice if they did, but they don't. I mean, they do have cameras in there and they will film things, but is there a channel where you can continuously watch it like at the national level? No, because unfortunately, the state doesn't have as much resources as the national government does. But yes, in the Texas House, they're also limited in terms of how much time the people have to speak and things like that. So okay, let's talk about the steps here. Okay, so how does a bill get to the governor's desk? So again, pretty much identical to what we see at the national level. So a bill is introduced. So any legislator can introduce a bill, and then it gets referred to the appropriate committee. And again, keep in mind that it's going to be referred to the committee that deals with that, with that subject matter, right? So if it's an education bill dealing with school funding, it's going to go to the education committee. Also keep in mind that, and again, this doesn't happen all the time because as I mentioned before, you don't have a very diverse legislature where you have people, professionals from all walks of professional life. It's limited to, basically just attorneys and business owners. They try to put committee members on committees based on their experience, right? So if let's say I was in the Texas legislature, I'd probably be on the education and corrections committees, right? Because I have experience in both of those fields. So they try to do the best they can, but because, like I said, because the legislature is not that diverse when it comes to professional experience, that's why it's usually hit or miss. With that being said, so a bill gets to the committee. Now the committee doesn't have to do anything with it. The committee can just table it and just not address it, and then the bill dies because the committee didn't do anything with it. Now, do keep in mind if it's a very important bill that the governor is really hammering home, and same thing with the presiding officers. They're not just going to they're not just going to be like, well, the committee didn't approve it or the committee didn't address it, so there's nothing we can do about it, right? If you're on that committee and you're not addressing a bill having to do with school vouchers, you're going to get a call from Governor Abbott, right? So depending on the importance of it and who's backing it and who's wanting it to get done, that'll also determine whether the committee takes action on it. So what committee action is where the committee will listen to testimony from people. That's where you might have seen like some videos where people are testifying, whether it's in Congress or in the state legislature, and that's what they're doing, right? When it comes to committees, they're trying to get information when it comes to their evaluation of this bill, right? So an example would be like if let's say Texas, as part of the like appropriations, let's say they're going to cut like some financial aid funding for colleges and universities. So you might have college presidents and college financial aid directors go testify in Austin about what they think about this bill, and then of course they'll make some suggestions because these are the experts, right? So the committee members will make those, not all the time, but sometimes they might make those changes. That's called marking up the bill, where they mark it up with those changes, and then they'll decide ultimately after they've heard enough testimony and after they've marked it up, they'll decide whether they want to approve it or not. So if the committee approves it, then it goes to the floor. And in the floor, of course, this is where you also have the ability for the other members to make amendments, right? Because obviously, of course, the other members probably have some say that they want some input on this bill. So they're going to want to propose amendments to it. And so that's why it's going to look way different than how it first started, right? So again, if let's say it gets out of, let's say, after the amendments and then it gets approved, then it goes to the other chamber and it starts the process all over again, right? So let's say you had a bill that started in the House and it got approved by the House with a majority vote. then it's going to go to the Senate, and it's got to go through the same process, right? It's got to be introduced, and it has to go to their committee, right? And what inevitably will happen is that then the Senate's going to make their changes, right? Their committee's going to make changes. They're going to mark it up, and then their Senate members are going to make their amendments, right? So now you have two separate bills in terms of they're the same subject, but they're radically different, right? And of course, we also have the filibuster, like I was mentioning, right? This is an opportunity where, because there's unlimited debate in the Senate, you have these senators that can. It doesn't get used that often, more so like there in Washington, but it can be used. I know one of the most famous filibusters was the Wendy Davis filibuster. Some of y'all remember that from a couple years ago, where Wendy Davis was this state senator from the Dallas area, a Democrat, and she, I think I have the video there in the additional resources, and she basically, and she was, she did, the whole like, all day into the night type of thing, where she was, standing and she couldn't sit down, and so they make it a lot more difficult than how it is in the U.S. Senate. The filibuster in the U.S. Senate is a little bit different now. They've changed some rules and things like that. But the idea was that you were supposed to just keep talking, right? That's the whole mythos of the filibuster, right? That it's like one person trying to take on the government type of thing, right? And so that's why with Wendy Davis' situation, and the reason why she was filibustering was the session was about to end that night. So now, of course, the governor then called another special session, but there was a lot of symbolism to that. And then, of course, so let's say, of course, then of course we have the conference committees where they try to iron out those details, between the two bills, because now if it went through both floors, now we basically have, it's kind of like a game of telephone. I don't know if you're familiar with that game, where you say something and then it gets all the way to the end of the line, and then you look to see how different it was from where the message began, right? So they're going to have to kind of iron out those details, compromise a bit, and so basically they get two new versions of the bill, and then of course it has to also then go back to the chambers to be voted upon, and if they both vote on that same version of the bill, then it gets to the governor's desk. Now, if you've taken federal government, you're probably familiar with the veto power, right? This is an important power that the executive has, right? The president, of course, can veto bills, basically nullifying them. The governor also can do this, and the governor's veto power usually tends to be even more. Let's see, I think it talks about it here, right? So again, it gives more of a description here when it comes to the lawmaking process here. But when we look at it, what I want for you all to also understand here is that the governor's veto power. The reason why I'm making the argument the governor's veto power is powerful is because, let's say the legislature is already out of session. If the governor vetoes something, then there's no way to override the veto. It can't go back to the legislature because the legislature's already gone. Now, in Washington, that doesn't normally happen because Congress usually meets continuously. But in the Texas legislature, where they only meet once every 2 years, this is a very powerful finality power that the governor has, where the governor can basically, let's say you've got a stack of bills, it's basically like turning in something like, and then the semester's already over, and you can't go and make a revision because the semester already ended, right? So it's kind of something like that, right? Where you just get the grade that you get because you really can't go and back and make any revisions because the semester's already over, right? So the governor can, so if the governor vetoes a bill and the committee is already, and the legislature's already gone, then it's basically, a finality, right? Let's see. Okay, so last couple of things that I wanted for today. Also keep in mind, and we'll talk more about this in the next chapter, the governor also has what's called the item veto, or the line item veto. This is basically where the governor can strike out portions of the appropriations bill. Because typically the way a veto works is it's either a yes or a no, right? The governor can't go and say, well, I'll agree to it, but if you make these changes, if you do this, if you do that, the governor can't go and he can't add amendments to it, right? Because he's not part of the legislature. So the governor can only basically give an up or down vote on it, right? Either he can either approve it or deny it. Except when it comes to the appropriations bill, that is where the governor can make changes, and the governor was doing that, or was threatening to do that in 2021. Remember how I mentioned that the Democrats took off during the special session, so the governor was threatening to use the line item veto when it came to not paying, the staffers, and the legislators that had left to Washington, right? So that's an example of how it can be used. Now, of course, let's also look at the legislative dynamics here. So there are limitations. when it comes to when it comes to how the legislature operates here now, do keep in mind that this is kind of the way the setup is in terms of when we look at the lawmaking process itself, there's always going to be limitations because did you see how difficult it was to get something passed, right? Did you see how many steps and hurdles it took for a bill to get to the governor's desk? And even then, the governor can just decide to veto it, and it's a final veto if the legislature's already out of session. So there's a bunch of places where a bill can slip up and basically die, right? So very few bills ultimately get to the governor's desk, right? So tons can be introduced, but how many of them are actually going to get to the governor's desk? Especially if, let's say, you're a Democrat and you're introducing a bill like when it comes to like accepting the Medicaid expansion or some of that, that's not going to get anywhere because you don't have the majority, right? So that's obviously something that Republicans, are not going to be in favor of. So you also have to keep in mind that, if you're in the minority party, it's going to be very difficult to get much of anything passed because you just don't have the votes for it, right? And of course, there's also changing alignments, differences in the House and the Senate, as of course we've mentioned here already at great detail throughout this class. That the presiding officers and the leadership within the two chambers do have some differences. Like I mentioned, Dave Phelan tends to be more of this. He tends to be a more moderate, a more cosmopolitan, business-oriented type of Republican, whereas Dan Patrick is a little bit more of like your Tea Partier, social conservative type of, probably a little bit more fiery rhetoric and things like that when it comes to, very, political, very political type of speech, things like that. And so this, these two personalities tend to clash, and we saw this, like I said, with the Ken Paxton situation. So we do have these differences within the presiding officers and things like that, right? So, and of course, we also have to look at how these different groups can also have differences when it comes to different coalitions, right, within the parties, right? That, like I mentioned, that the Republicans are a little bit more divided in Texas than the Democrats are in Texas, which makes sense because when you're in the majority, what I'm trying to say here is that being in the majority, I mean, we saw this also with what happened with Kevin McCarthy, right? That being in the majority, it kind of emboldens people to advocate for their issues because they feel like they can have the votes for this or things like that. What I'm trying to say is that the majority parties, this usually is where you tend to see more infighting and more disagreement because because they're in power, right? So there's differences on what to do with that power. If you don't have the power, then you're united in trying to get that power, right? It's kind of like where, let me use a sports analogy. For some of y'all who are sports fans, have y'all noticed that it's pretty difficult for teams to repeat as champions because they're always being, the other teams are going after them, right? They're on top and the other teams are trying to knock them off. So it's kind of similar like we see here, like with politics, right? The Democrats tend to be more united right now politically because they are not in the majority. They don't have the power and they're trying to get that power. And then once they do, there's a good chance you'll probably see, if they do, there's probably a good chance you'll see some of those same issues that you might see on the Republican side. So I don't know if I was doing a good job explaining it, but I wanted to use a sports analogy to kind of explain that a bit. And then, of course, there's also non-legislative lawmaking, like we touched on the governor, right, with the veto power, but also the governor also has a lot of influence. And we'll talk about this in the next chapter, how the governor has influence when it comes to the appointment power in terms of appointing heads of state agencies, right? The governor, basically appointment means hiring, right? The governor can hire heads of state agencies like the DPS director and all of these other agencies. The governor is the one who ultimately appoints these people in authority, as well as a lot of boards, not the elected ones, obviously, but there's a lot of other, appointed boards. Like I mentioned, the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board, that's a board that's appointed by the governor, right? So the governor can put his people in place, and those people within the administration are going to want to reflect the governor's vision, right? So if the governor is hiring someone for, to be head of a state agency, then of course this person is going to share in the vision of the governor because the governor is not going to hire someone that isn't going to agree with what the governor wants for the agencies to do. So the administrators are basically like, I guess you could say kind of like, like, I don't know how I would say it, I guess like, yeah, I mean, they do technically work for the governor, right? So they do report to the governor. So the governor's their boss, right? So they're going to ultimately do what their boss tells them to do, right? And of course, we also have the courts. The courts, not just the Texas courts, but also the federal courts, obviously, of course, have the ability to interpret, the laws of the state. So, like for state courts, they can make rulings on state laws, and the federal laws can make rulings on state laws as well. And the federal courts can also make rulings on state laws as well. So the courts can also get in and determine whether something is, constitutional or not here. Okay, so let's go to an end here for today. So let's talk about the reforms here. I did want to kind of, I don't think we're gonna have time. I did want to kind of go over a little bit on some of the legislative accomplishments, but if we have time later on, maybe we can do that later on in the semester. But let's talk about this really quickly in terms of the suggested reforms here, right? So the book does mention that there are some issues when it comes to how Texas ultimately operates within the legislature, right? So one of the reforms is the legislature be in session every year for most of the year. So instead of the biennial sessions, instead you would have annual sessions. And I've mentioned before how this is something where you might be able to try to get some compromise where, okay, fine, we're not going to just replicate Congress, right, where they're constantly meeting, but could we meet at least once a year? And I know the book talks about how meeting most of the year, but maybe another alternative could be like, fine, we'll just meet for the spring semester, but could we do that every year? Like, could we meet, maybe, I mean, because of all the special sessions we've had in the summer and even into the fall, maybe we can extend that over to the summer, maybe, so maybe coinciding with the start of the new fiscal year at the beginning of September. So again, this is an idea that of course has been floated about, but of course we would have to, amend the Constitution for that. And we've talked about how that, this is obviously going to be more expensive. It's going to be more pay. So, Texas, priding itself on being a low tax state, this is something that people might not necessarily be okay with. Again, going back to money, right? A lot of this has to deal with money, right? Legislators paid a salary commensurate with the importance of their jobs, at least as much as the legislators in California, which tend to make about 150,000, a little bit less than what members of Congress make. They make about 175, but certainly a lot more than 7,200. Like I was saying, some people might look at that number and they might think, oh, that's how much they make in a month. No, that's not how much they make in a month. That is how much they make in a year. And let me do some quick math here. If we did 7,200 times 12, that gets you to $86,000. So still, or 86 and a half. So still not quite what you would see in California, although of course you also have to take into account that California has a very high cost of living, although Texas is starting to get to that point. But that's still a much bigger, salary bump than just the 7,200 here. And of course, also keep in mind that because it would now be, if we had sessions every year, we would also want for our legislators to be paid full time, right? Because obviously, of course, getting paid 7,200, it's not even part time here. Legislators forbidden to take any benefit from lobbyists. Instead, the state would finance their election campaigns, right? We will talk about how this is a major issue when it comes to this whole concept of, money in politics, right? And how elections are privately funded, and how you've got these super PACs that are donating money not to candidates, but on behalf of the elections that these candidates are involved in, right? So we'll definitely take a long look at the lobbying situation, the interest groups chapter, when we look at money in politics, and how this would be something where it wouldn't necessarily be the most connected, right? So when I look at people in Congress now, when I was younger, I used to think, wow, these must be the smartest of the smartest people, and a lot of them are very qualified. But some of them also are very rich and very wealthy, and they have a lot of connections. So you also have to look at that too. So, if we limited the amount of influence that the interest groups have, maybe that could allow for, a greater pool of people to go and serve in these, in government. But for now, we're kind of limited, and we'll talk about some of the pros and cons of this, because there are some pros to interest groups. I don't want to make it sound like it's all negative, but we'll take a look at that here. And then, of course, staff allowances should be generous, so legislators could afford to hire intelligent, public-spirited people to give them information and analyze bills in terms of cost-benefit, right? And again, like I was saying earlier, no disrespect to some of these people who are working for the legislators now. Like I said, my friend, she's, she's really brilliant. She's going to be moving on to, doing very important things. But that's the problem, is that she's needed there. That job that she's doing is extremely important, but her pay is not commensurate with the importance of that job. So, I wouldn't do that job. I mean, not for that pay, not giving up what I have right now, because I've got bills to pay, right? So if we could transform the legislature not just in their pay, but also the staff payments, and actually allow for, these positions to actually be paid at the level that, that this job definitely entails, we would definitely get more, much more qualified people, and maybe not even necessarily more qualified, but more active, right? If you're making $10 an hour, you might not, it's going to be hard to give your best. But if you're making, double that, maybe even more, then yes, that'll definitely be good motivation to allow for you to do a better job. Because like I said, the staffers have a very essential job in the Texas government here. So, okay, let's go ahead and end here for today. Let me go ahead and stop the share, and let's stop the record button here. Get that going.